Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. Joining us now is former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales. He is out with a new book. It's called True Faith and Allegiance, a story of service and sacrifice in war and peace, about his life and time serving the George W. Bush administration. Welcome. I want to start with the scene where you were briefly the one administration official to be off in a secret location. Tell us first a little bit about that experience, and then you said it gave you a new appreciation for the presidency. How so?
Well, of course, every year one cabinet official is asked to stay away.
During the State of the Union.
During the State of the Union, in case there's a disaster and someone in the line of presidential succession is still alive to become President of the United States. In 2007, I was advised just days before the State of the Union that I would be that person. And so I spent that evening on an airplane flying around. And I remember thinking, watching President Bush give the address that evening, and I've advised President Bush through something like 50 federal and state executions, through 2 wars. So I've experienced pretty big moments with him before. But sitting on that airplane, it suddenly hit me, oh my gosh, if something happened in Washington, would I and the people on that airplane be able to govern a wounded nation? President finishes his speech. We're ordered to head back to Andrews Air Force Base, and we land. And I really had an appreciation of the tremendous pressure and power. The opportunity to be President of the United States was really kind of special.
Yeah, well, we're in the middle of a campaign where people are imagining the candidates stepping into that role that you stepped into for 45 minutes or however long the speech was. You've said that it takes a special kind of person to be president.
Absolutely.
What do you mean by that?
Looking at the president make decisions about who should go on the Supreme Court, or the decision to send men and women into battle, I think it takes someone with a great deal of integrity. I think of very few jobs or vocations where integrity matters most. The American people want to know that the most powerful person in the world, is constrained by the Constitution and not use that office for personal or political gain. It takes someone with wisdom. No one is born with wisdom. It comes from experience. So I think wisdom is very, very important. It also takes someone with vision, a positive vision for America, someone who can say, come with me, I can take you to a better place. I think Americans want to believe in someone who believes in them. And so, and courage. The office is about decision making. I heard President Bush say this often, and you have to have the courage to make the tough decisions, because at the end of the day, that's what the American people expect, is you to make the right decision, to be bold and address the problems of this country. And
so you're a Republican. Does Donald Trump have those qualities you just outlined?
Well, I'm still evaluating
It's
Donald.
been 15 months. What's to evaluate?
Well, because he shifts positions from time to time, and I don't know Donald Trump. I don't think I've ever met Donald Trump. And so I think being able to know someone takes some time. And I know there are a lot of good people that I trust and know who are not supporting him. And what it tells me is that I need to study this man very, very closely. I don't think Americans should make a decision based upon the recommendation of anyone else. For example, if I today said, I don't support Donald Trump, or I do support Donald Trump, I wouldn't expect other Americans to follow my lead. I would expect them to do their own investigation, evaluation as to whether or not this is the right person for them and their families, and to lead this country.
Based on those criteria you outline and that you outline in the book, True Faith and Allegiance. Let me ask you another thing you said about Donald Trump's comments about Mexico, because he went and made the trip this week. Donald Trump said, just to remind people, they bring drugs, they bring crime, they're rapists. In response to that, you said you can't unring that bell. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, there are consequences to the words of when a president makes a statement, and I talk about that in the book in terms of once the president makes a statement, it's very, very difficult to walk that back. And so I think someone in the Oval Office has to be very careful about the words they say, because there are consequences, and quite frankly, there should be consequences. When the president draws a red line in the sand and says, if you go beyond that, there will be consequences, there can be no doubt in the minds of our enemies that we intend to follow up, and that there will be consequences. So the words are very important from someone who sits in the Oval Office.
Let me ask you about an anecdote in the book that got a lot of attention at the time. It was March of 2004. John Ashcroft was the Attorney General. Right. You're counsel to the president. There's a scene in his hospital room where you're trying to get an extension for the warrantless wiretapping program.
Yes.
And there have been different stories told about this. Director Comey, now a director of the FBI, says that you and Andy Card were there to try and as he put it, take advantage of a very sick man.
Right.
You tell your version of the story of what
Yes.
happened in the hospital room trying to get that extension. How did it go as you saw it?
Well, you're right. I spent some time in the book talking about this, and I would just say that I testified under oath about what happened in that hospital room. And the Inspector General of the Department of Justice also spoke to me about what happened in that hospital room. And so I am on record under oath about what happened, and no one has contested my description of what happened. Listen, Andy Carter and I spoke 2 times before entering that hospital room about our concern that he might not be competent.
The Attorney General, John Ashcroft, who just had surgery.
Who had just had surgery. And if he wasn't competent, then we were not going to ask him to do anything. We were primarily there to report on a meeting we had just had with congressional leaders about this very same program and about the dispute, and the congressional leaders telling us we believe we should go forward with the program.
Continue the program.
Because it is so important in protecting American lives. And of course, the very next day we had the Madrid train bombings. It was a very dangerous time for our country, and we were trying to do what we could to ensure that we had the tools necessary to protect America.
In terms of the warrantless wiretapping and then also enhanced interrogation, which you oversaw as well.
I didn't oversee it.
But
okay,
you advised on it in your capacity with the president.
Well, I was counsel to the president, but the advice came from the Department of Justice, the senior leadership of the department, and the lawyers within the administration saying, done a certain way, it would be effective and it would be lawful.
And I apologize, not an unimportant fact. But how do you feel looking back on both of those things? Both of those policies have been changed. Mm-hmm. In the Republican race right now, there are some, well, Donald Trump is saying, bring back waterboarding. It would be great. What do you feel about that?
I think we should only be doing those things that are absolutely necessary and effective and lawful. And the question—
Was that true of enhanced interrogation
Absolutely.
techniques?
That it was effective, and we've had testimony by folks from the CIA and the FBI talking about information that we got from the program. And at the time, the Department of Justice issued an opinion that if waterboarding, for example, was done with certain supervision, and it was only done to 3 people, high-level detainees, who we believed had information about a pending attack against the United States, that it would be lawful. And so this was, obviously very, very controversial. And I don't mean in this book to try to convince anyone who believes that waterboarding was torture, that it wasn't torture. I merely meant to point out that the lawyers worked very, very hard to get this right, to ensure that the CIA and the policymakers had the tools that they believed was necessary to protect this country.
But just very briefly, a parting question here. Your view now, if it were to come back, there's a legal pathway to bring waterboarding back, or is that closed?
Would I support it? I'd have to want to talk to the CIA folks to say, first of all, what is the threat? If in fact someone has information about a bomb that's about to go off in Washington D.C. in the next half hour, and we have someone in custody that we know has information about that. Even Chuck Schumer said in that kind of scenario, Senator Chuck Schumer from New York said, yes, he would authorize torture, assuming, again, I'm not suggesting that it would be torture as a legal matter, but that would be a tool that I think we should pursue under certain kind of circumstances.
All right, Alberto Gonzales, the book is True Faith and Allegiance. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John.
We'll be right back with our panel. Joining us now for political analysis, Susan Page is USA Today's Washington bureau chief. Jamel Bouie is chief political correspondent for Slate magazine, and he's a CBS News political analyst. Molly Ball covers politics for The Atlantic, and Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor at the National Review and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Ramesh, I want to start with you. At the end of the week, Donald Trump has been to Mexico, met with the Mexican president. He also gave a zesty speech in Arizona in the same day. Do the calculation. Where do things stand at the end of the week with Donald Trump and immigration?
Well, I think that it is a confusing story. Today on the airwaves, Trump supporters Chris Christie on this show and Rudy Giuliani are saying he has softened on immigration, he is no longer for mass deportation, and this story is not getting through. Well, one of the reasons it's not getting through is that Trump didn't actually say that mass deportation's not on the table anymore. He simply implied it. And he did it in a speech that was all of the atmospherics of it were extremely hard line. It's a speech that actually reads differently than it looks. And I don't see how the Trump campaign expects that it is going to get credit for softening, which it clearly wants, if it won't actually come out and make that message more explicit.
Molly, I was surprised that Chris Christie used the word pause. I mean, Donald Trump during the primaries said the undocumented immigrants in America will be out so fast your head will spin. That is very different than the word pause.
It is. Look, there's been a lot of attempts to muddy the water, but I really think that a decision was made when Trump gave that immigration speech that he cannot walk back. And as Ramesh was saying, the decision was made to cast this issue in very harsh terms, to continue to depict illegal immigrants as criminals and as a danger to this country. And so whatever policy is in the fine print, and I don't think we will ever know that because he's taken all of the positions at once in a way, but the tone of that speech, I think, really closed a door for Trump with some voters who were looking for him to be more compassionate, to strike a tone more of acceptance, no matter what policy he's advocating. I think with certain Hispanic voters and certain non-Hispanic voters, there might have been an open door, and that door was closed by the decision that Trump made to give that speech.
Jamel, who are those voters that Donald Trump's trying to appeal to with this softening, whatever we want to call it, whether it exists or doesn't exist?
I think it's whatever percentage of voters, Republican voters, that are staying away from states like Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina. Like North Carolina, Mitt Romney won that by a slim margin in 2012, and it's pretty much a must-win state for Donald Trump. And I think that margin is mostly the result of Republican voters who are just staying away. And you have all these activated and energized Democratic voters who are sort of taking their place. So as long as Trump is losing that group, which is college educated, which is suburban, which is predominates in states like Virginia, Colorado, is important in Pennsylvania. As long as Trump is losing that group of voters, then his path to 270 electoral votes is very narrow, if increasingly non-existent.
You know, it's interesting. If you look at most of the demographic groups, they are pretty stable from 4 years ago, and the one exception are college-educated whites.
Right.
In the exit polls in 2012, college-educated whites went Republican by 14 percentage points. And in the last Pew Research Center poll, which is a big respected poll, they went for Hillary Clinton by 14 percentage points. That is the kind of swing that I don't think we've seen before with a big group in American politics since we started polling in the 1950s.
Meaning she's up by 14.
She's up by 14, whereas Barack Obama lost them by 14 points just 4 years ago. Think of what a big swing that is among college-educated whites, a huge part of the U.S. population, a huge part of the electorate in just 4 years. I was talking to political scientists this week's Alan Abramowitz at Emory, who spends a lot of time looking at these questions. We couldn't come up with another example of that kind of swing since 1952, when we started to be able to look at the demographics of presidential elections.
Well, and the gamble of the Trump campaign is that he is realigning the electorate to make up for that swing by attracting more non-college educated white voters and a lot of Democrats. But we haven't seen him do that.
Right.
As you say, all the other groups are stable.
You mentioned Abramowitz. He has a model of election returns that predicts, based on the economy, based on these variables, Trump should win, Clinton should lose. But he doesn't actually think that's going to happen because Trump has run such a different kind of campaign that has scrambled the electorate in that way.
Jamel, do you think, going back to this point that Molly was making about realigning the electorate, if that's your take, then wouldn't you not need to do the softening because you're realigning? In other words, do you see in the softening undermining this notion that there's a huge group of people out there?
I mean, the softening, I think, is de facto evidence that this group of people isn't there, or if it's not large enough to make up for the voters you're losing. I think the original theory was that Trump could have this hardline message and begin to pull non-college educated whites, and specifically non-college educated white men, from Democrats, those who aren't voting, pull them into the electorate. But what's happened is basically, yeah, you have this action reactivating a bunch of these voters, but you have a reaction too from college-educated whites, from African Americans, from Latinos, and the reaction is essentially overwhelming the action. And the Trump campaign is now trying to figure out how it can mitigate the reaction, but I just don't think it has time to do so at this point.
Is this, Molly, what you saw in his visit to the Detroit church? This is also a part of this effort, and where do we think that? Is it going to be successful, meaningful? Is it about African Americans, or is it about this group of college-educated voters that we've been talking about?
If there is a political calculation, and I think that's always an if with Trump and his campaign because so much of it is so improvisational and sort of based on the gut. But if there is a calculation, it probably is much more about those white swing voters. On the other hand, you see him getting 0 or 1 or 2% of the African American vote in these polls. There may literally be nowhere to go but up for Donald Trump. And those images where he at least seems to be making contact and listening to African Americans could give him some lift there, but it does seem to be mostly about the predominantly white portion of the electorate that looks at him and believes that he's a racist, that he's intolerant, that he's hateful, and wants to be reassured. These people want to vote for the Republican.
Right.
They want to vote for the person with the R next to his name, and that's why I think Trump still has some upside, but he needs to convince them that they can do that.
And there's some good political science that notes that part of the gender gap in presidential elections is essentially a function of white racial views, that women tend to have softer and less conservative racial views than men do. And when they see candidates who are hardline or seemingly hardline on racial issues, they react very negatively. And so George W. Bush, for example, did better than you would expect among white college-educated women, in part because his brand, as it were, was a Republican with more liberal racial views than your typical Republican.
Ramesh, let me ask you a question about how to fix this brand issue, because you can't do it in one event. And yet, when Donald Trump went to meet with the president of Mexico, the word presidential got thrown around a lot. I'm going to apply to the wisdom of the group here. What does it mean to be presidential in a campaign context? What's the real benefit of presidential?
If you look at the breakdown in that North Carolina poll from CBS, a majority of North Carolina voters don't believe that Donald Trump is ready to be commander-in-chief. That is what it means. That is, I think, the central problem of his candidacy. People dislike him, people dislike her, but they think she is ready to be commander-in-chief. They don't believe that he is. That, I think, is when we're talking about presidential, when we're talking about gravitas, changing his image, that's the key thing he has to do.
And can you do it, though, Susan? And you've been to many of those kinds of presidential moments, but can you do it in just standing up there and having an image? Is that good enough?
Well, I think that combined with a good performance in debates is probably good enough, because you in fact have an electorate that wants to vote against Hillary Clinton because they don't think she's honest and trustworthy, because they're ready for change after 8 years of a Democratic administration. But Donald Trump, at least so far, has not gotten over the hurdle of looking like you can trust him to be commander-in-chief. That doesn't, I don't think you could say there's no time left for him to do this, because despite all the disadvantages that we've talked about so far for Donald Trump, he's still within striking distance in your national poll, 2 points in your battleground states poll. That, and we've got, what, 65 days left.
Right. Well, you've given us a segue to talk about Hillary Clinton. Jamel, new information about her FBI interview. The numbers are very soft. In some polls, they're coming down. What is the state of Hillary Clinton's campaign? And, I mean, it's now been several weeks that this comes up. It's a bruise that keeps getting hit.
I pretty much think at this point you can tie Hillary Clinton's fortunes in national polls to the tenor of her news coverage. When news coverage of Clinton is good or neutral, like just after the Democratic conventions, her poll numbers basically hit your 48, your 49% level, and she ends up establishing a 7 or 8 point lead over Trump. When the emails come in, when the foundation comes in, when these questions that remind people of all the things that they do not like about Hillary Clinton, that they do not like about the broader political world come in, her numbers immediately soften to 45, 44. And that's basically been the story going back to even April and May. Her lead after the convention was very similar to her lead right at that time. The difference, well, not the difference, but the same pattern happened. In April and May, you had conversations about her emails and the foundation and her speeches and Bernie's attacks, and it softened her to 44, 45. And I think it's almost like a timing game that we'll just see come November where she is in this cycle.
Ramesh, did you take anything away from those FBI reports that is new, or it just sort of the general issue that she has on this that will be with her all the way through to November?
There's always another piece of evidence that tends to reinforce the public's view that there is a lack of transparency, a lack of honesty and forthcomingness from Hillary Clinton. And I don't think that stories about Clinton aides destroying phones with hammers is going to help her in any way. I talked to a Republican about this, a Republican strategist who said, well, at least somebody's keeping this race competitive.
And yet a big potential scandal involving Donald Trump, and I was glad you asked Chris Christie about it, because I'm surprised it hasn't gotten more attention, which is that Donald Trump in 2013, his foundation made an illegal $25,000 contribution to a campaign committee associated with the Florida Attorney General, who was at that time deciding whether to pursue an investigation into Trump University. And this is the kind of thing, he's now paid a fine, which is, as the Washington Post has reported. This should be a major story, and I'm perplexed by why it hasn't gotten more attention. I think one reason is there's so much attention to her scandals, and her credibility to make attacks on the front of honesty and trustworthiness are so low that it's harder for her to generate outrage about this potential scandal involving him.
Well, and also
it's a good news cycle for the third-party candidates, I'd say.
Right. Donald Trump has also boasted about being able to do precisely that, give donations to get what he wants. I mean, he hasn't been shy about this. He hasn't spoken directly to that thing, but he has said that's why the system's so corrupt, because I was a master at playing it. Yeah. Molly, let me ask you about on Hillary Clinton. When she speaks, is that good for her campaign or bad, no matter what the topic?
I think it depends. I don't think it is the case that every time she opens her mouth, she makes things worse. And I wish she would hold a press conference. I think that whether or not she got herself into further trouble with her answers to questions, it would be refreshing to see her facing the press and answering questions. And, you know, she's playing a very conventional campaign strategy where you spend your August fundraising and then you assume that the campaign engages in full after Labor Day. So I think it's safe to assume that we will see more of her doing public events and giving speeches after Labor Day.
Jamel, she's likely to give more policy speeches. Is that a way to beat back the criticism that she's kind of disappeared during August, raised a lot of money while she disappeared? But is that a way out of the fix she faces?
I'm not entirely sure, because I think when it comes to Hillary Clinton's public perception, people kind of just think that she knows a lot, that she's very prepared with regards to policy. The things that people do not like or do not believe about Hillary Clinton, they do not like that she's secretive. They do not believe that she cares about people like them. And I'm not sure if more policy speeches will fix that latter problem. I don't know if she needs to fix the former problem. Bill Clinton never ever really quite fixed the former problem about his trustworthiness, but he was able to convince people that he cared about them. And I think that's Clinton's challenge going forward.
And it may be impossible to fix the first. The cares about you, she could presumably, if she gave good enough speeches about solutions, that might work. That's it for us. Thank you all very much. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us. We turn now for a moment from the negativity of our presidential race to an event that has brought multitudes together in celebration. At the Vatican this morning, Mother Teresa was declared a saint at a mass for 120,000 people in St. Peter's Square. Pope Francis praised the Albanian-born nun who died 19 years ago for dedicating her life to serving the poorest of the poor in Indian slums, calling on world leaders to end the crimes of poverty they themselves created. St. Teresa stood just 5 feet tall, but as a voice for the poor who often go unseen, she made an impact that could be seen across the world. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Join us next week when we'll have CIA Director John Brennan. For Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson. Enjoy your Labor Day.